Hey there, it's Miss Kristina in Maker Exchange over at the Corona Public Library. And today we're doing episode 3 of video editing, and we are still working on Adobe Premiere Rush. Today we are going to be focusing on doing speed ups and slow-mos in our videos. Both can add a very dramatic effect to our video. A speed up does not require any special settings before filming. However, your slow-mo does require you to go into your settings and change your frames per second, or FPS, to a higher rate. The more frames per second we have, the better the slow-mo, or the slower we can go. Your frames per second are the same as pages per flips in an old-fashioned flip book such as these. So the more pages that we have in our flip book, the better or smoother the appearance of our slow-mo. And the same thing goes for our frames per second. The more frames we have, the more fluid our slow-mo is, or the slower we can go. Now there are several different common rates of frames per second. 24 rates per second is commonly used in cinema. So all of our movies such as Jurassic Park. 30 is commonly used in news as well as sitcoms to have a slightly realistic effect. The Hobbit used 48 frames per second to create a more realistic effect. 60 frames per second is commonly used in reality TV. 120 is commonly used in video games or doing a slow-mo such as running. 240 frames per second is used in a lot of newer video games to create a more realistic effect and smoother transitions, as well as slow-mos such as fire. If you want a realistic looking film such as The Hobbit, you would need to film at 48 frames per second, edit at 48 frames per second, and then render at 48 frames per second. You cannot film at 48 frames per second, edit at 30, and then have it rendered at 60. It just doesn't work that way. So for example, this film is edited at 30 and rendered at 30, even though I'm using video footage that has been shot at 120 or 60. So you're not going to see the changes. It's going to all look like 30 frames per second, or the news or sitcoms. If you want to see the differences, I suggest looking at different movies or TV shows, as some of the samples on YouTube claim to be higher frames per second. However, it is unsure or unclear if they have edited and rendered at that frames per second. So I highly suggest to look at movies to see the differences, or TV shows to see the differences, or somebody that you trust that has edited and uploaded at that frame per second. I have a few examples to show you the power and the differences of doing slow-mos and the importance of doing high rates of frames per second. So this film was shot at about 60 frames per second. And the slower we go, we're going to notice it get a little bit more choppy and a little bit more choppy. So the higher the frames per second we do, the smoother the slowest we go will look. However, please keep in mind that the higher the frames per second you do, the larger the document is going to be, and it's not necessary for most video footage. So here we're looking at some snow, and as you can see, doing a speed up, it does not change the quality of the picture. However, as we go slower, and this was shot at about 30 frames per second, you can't notice it as much with the snow, but you do notice it with the water that is running. The water is starting to get really choppy as we do our slow-mo. So the higher the frames per second when being shot, the easier the slow-mo is when doing an edit at 30 frames per second. Now this video was shot at 160 frames per second. So here we're going to be able to see it slow down a little bit more than the others without it getting so choppy. So here's the 80% and it still looks good. But once we hit that 45%, we're starting to see it get choppy and then 15% just does not look good. So the next time you want to do a slow-mo, be sure to check your settings before you do your filming. And if you want a more realistic appearance in your film, be sure to film, edit, and render at that frames per second rate that you want it to appear. And that's it for today. See you next time.